Empire. How advertisers are reaching fans on sports' biggest stage.
So if you go back to the question of matchups, that's how many people are watching and how much value is that viewership or exposure worth. But then the first piece of that equation is how much exposure is a given brand getting.
That's Dan Calpin, president of Hive AI, who is studying how advertisement of all forms perform in real time. This is the Future Sport Podcast. I'm Bram Weinstein. The Final Four turned out to be the most recent example of a perfect storm for sports fans and those trying to reach them. This year's version included an ultimate storyline, Duke in Coach K's final season, facing arch rival North Carolina for the right to play in the national championship. So the hype was built in, and the traditional ratings and interest were presumably way up. So did advertisers perform well here, and if so, how? That's what Dan Calpin and Kyle Folts, vice president at Elevate Sports Ventures, measured. Our guests this week are Dan Calpin. He's the president of Hive AI, which is a company that studies content and understanding its meaning, and Kyle Folts, who's the vice president at Elevate Sports Ventures. And together, they put together a brand exposure study for the recently completed and historic NCAA tournament. Thank you both for being here.
Thanks so much for having us, Bram. We're happy to be here, and I think between Kyle and I, very complementary set of experiences on how AI is being used to practice better measurement from the value of sponsorships and how brands and right holders are using that data to get ahead.
Cool. Let me get into the tech in a moment, but I want to start this very old schooly with you, and maybe Kyle, you might be better to kind of address this. That tournament could not have asked for better matchups, specifically in their Final Four. So as you kind of go through measuring what the brand exposure was, take me back old school to there's a tremendous amount of interest, a tremendous amount of engagement around who was playing each other, specifically Duke and North Carolina, and how that kind of factored into the results that you got.
Yeah, Bram, that's a great question. You say take me back old school. And that brings me way back old school. I remember when we first got into this space 15, 17 years ago, you were really consisted of interns using stopwatches to gauge how frequently something was on screen, how frequently a sponsor was exposed on screen. And what that missed was the quality of the exposure. What that missed was how engaged were fans, how large is the viewing audience. And so you mentioned these incredible matchups, and what that really does is drive value across the board for sponsors. You have more people viewing it. People are more in tune with what's going on. And then the amplification beyond the game. The fact is that much of the sponsor exposure is generated after the final whistle blows. So with highlights and social media, you're seeing a significant amount of value that is delivered to these brands after the game because of the fact that you have these incredible matchups.
So matchups still matter, Kyle, is that right? Like, having marquee matchups still matter even in this day and age of engagement?
Yeah, what we see from some of our brand clients is that not just matchups, but picking the right horse matters. So we have clients that we work with that look at things like odds of how a team might perform throughout the season, and they actually help drive the decision-making process of this team is going to be good. Are they more likely to advance further into the playoffs, more likely to advance further into a tournament? It's going to drive more value back to that particular brand through the measurement that Dan and his team at Hive are providing from a media valuation perspective.
Okay, Dan, so let's get into that a little bit and the technology here. This is new school now. How do you go about measuring what happens with traditional advertising and in-content exposure to come to the conclusions you've come to?
Yeah, well, I'll pick up where Kyle left off. The legacy approach to sponsorship measurement. This is not a new practice. It's something that's been in play for decades, and to Kyle's point, historically was done pen, paper, stopwatch, and maybe some tiers. Going through figuring out the numbers. I think now the opportunity is you can measure that faster, you can measure that more granularly, you can measure that more comprehensively, and ultimately more consistently. And so if you go back to the question of matchups, that's the, how many people are watching and how much value is that viewership or exposure worth. But then the first piece of that equation is how much exposure is a given brand getting. And so what we do at Hive, we're a San Francisco-based AI company, focusing our customers understand what's happening in content. And so if you think of the exposure of a Nike swoosh on a jersey, a broadcaster referencing the name of a stadium naming rights partner, what our technology is doing is we're ingesting, just taking TV as an example, every second from every program on just about every network of television, and then running our AI models through that content to understand that exposure and translate that into ultimately a value that those brands are achieving from those placements.
Could you go a little deeper and tell us how it works and explain how the AI works here?
Yeah, absolutely. So the foundation of our business actually starts with training AI models to think like a human brain. And so if you think of how a child would learn animals, or maybe specifically how a child would recognize a Nike logo versus the Coca-Cola logo, they see a lot of examples. And so that's the same way that we train our models. And we have about 300 million pieces of hand-labeled data that go into training this model to recognize brands, as well as to recognize asset types. And so then that's one piece of the equation, which is the technology. The second part is the ingestion. And so our models essentially watch television the same way that the three of us do, except beyond looking for the gameplay, they're specifically focused on brand exposure. And so what that results in is we're looking at about 3,500 hours of television every day. And from that, coming up with about 15 million rows of data on brand exposure. And
so take me through how it understands pivotal key moments that could be amplified, could go viral, would be different than just the run-of-the-mill, you see a close-up of a guy running back on defense and there's a logo on his jersey and it's caught on screen. How does it start to understand moments that will kind of linger on beyond the run-of-the-mill play in a sporting event?
Yep, great question, Bram. So the first piece of this is being able to understand the exposure itself. And so if you think of the brand that's essentially, is something present? How long is it present? And what is the quality of that exposure? And so for a brand, the bigger that their logo is, the more central it is on the screen, the more clear that it is, and the number of brands that are competing for attention essentially go into how memorable that placement is. And then the second part of it is essentially what's the shelf life of that audience. And so there's the live audience. We're back to the question on matchups. The more people that are watching and the more advertisers are paying to be alongside that content, the more valuable those in-content placements are. And then if you think of the other piece, which Kyle hit on earlier around amplification, we find a tremendous amount of value that exists in highlights and shoulder programming and social media content. And so being a part of those moments and those games creates a massive increase in the amount of value that brands are realizing.
All right, Kyle. So take me through some of the results that you found from the recent NCAA tournament. What did you learn about brand exposure?
And we're really excited by the response that we've seen to the study. As you mentioned, we analyzed all 134 games that made up the men's and women's NCAA tournament. Some of the findings that were really compelling: 187 cumulative hours of exposure for sponsors, over $410 million in equivalent media value. To put that into comparison, $410 million equates to roughly 70 30-second commercials in the Super Bowl. So we're talking tremendous value back to the sponsors. But I think what the study really highlights is this kind of sea change where it's really important for brands and properties to understand how their assets are performing. We have this unique opportunity in time where we've got this technology that allows us to dictate what does it matter to be on a uniform versus on court, or versus courtside rotational sign in the NCAA tournament. And at Elevate Sports Ventures, that's exactly what we do. We help our partners understand the value of this exposure at a deeper level. How does it meet their objectives? How are we making sure that we're able to communicate the value proposition of your brand through these platforms? So it's taking the data as a foundation and enhancing it to help our partners understand how to use it and how to optimize their partnerships.
Can you talk about some of these things specifically? Because logos on uniforms is still it's not novel, but it's still relatively new in American sports. How is it performing now that teams have logos on their jerseys?
Yeah, so we're seeing a huge swing in the next 2 years, or even sooner. We're going to see Major League Baseball and the NHL both come online on uniform logos. The NBA has obviously had it for quite a while, and Major League Soccer as well. And it's been interesting to watch the transition from kind of emerging new categories that we're sponsoring on uniform technology companies. Now we're starting to see the more traditional categories, like financial services, like insurance. And what that suggests is that the market's getting more mature. And in large part, that's because while they are very heavily brand exposure plays, in the NHL, we see 8+ minutes per game that we predict for the on uniform. In the NBA, 7 to 9. So while we are delivering tremendous exposure, it's how those brands are complementing that exposure with other extensions and other benefits in their partnership. So we're really kind of combining two factors here, this brand play along with tying back and associating with that property to increase your brand profile.
Like what? What do you mean by that? Like just getting the exposure to what? To incentivize fans to act upon the exposure itself?
Well, so in terms of what other benefits are these properties providing to these sponsors? So a really good example, we see a technology sponsor, client of ours, is on uniform in the NBA. And their partnership is really enhanced by a STEM program. So they work with local schools to develop a STEM program that focuses on, obviously STEM concepts. But what you're doing there is you're tying in the community benefits with this brand play, and it's just creating a better brand health for that particular sponsor in that marketplace.
Guys, if you're looking for that extra confidence when it's time to have a little bit of fun, let me tell you about BlueChew.com. Blue Chew is a unique online service. It delivers the same active ingredients as Viagra and Cialis, but it comes in chewable form, and it's at a fraction of the cost. Blue Chew's tablets will help you combat all forms of ED. Plus, it's an online prescription service. No visits to the doctor's office, no awkward conversations, no waiting in line at the pharmacy, and it ships right to your door in a discreet package. The process is really simple. Sign up at BlueChew.com, consult with one of their licensed medical providers, and once you are approved, you'll receive your prescription within days, and the best part, all done online. Blue Chew's licensed medical providers are going to work with you to find the right ingredient and the strength for your personal subscription. Plus, their tablets are made in the United States. They prepare, they ship direct, and it's so much cheaper than going through a pharmacy. And here's a special deal for our listeners. Try Blue Chew free when you use our promo code FUTURE, F-U-T-R, at checkout. Just pay $5 shipping. That's BlueChew.com, promo code FUTURE, F-U-T-R, to receive your first month free. And we thank Blue Chew for being a sponsor of this show. One more old school one, because you mentioned it, which is the rotating screen that has been at center court forever, in basketball games. Is the value still there in that old school method of advertising?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. What we see on average is those rotational signs or more dynamic signs like LED command a higher premium in the marketplace than a passive static sign. So a static, sign up in the rafters versus that LED sign, even if they get the same amount of exposure, brands pay a premium for that particular rotating sign because you're able to communicate some level of messaging. And frankly, it comes back to, the data that Dan and team are providing. The quality of that exposure is so much greater than kind of that static sign that may be smaller or not in the center of the camera and all of those types of things.
And the piece that I would build on that is what I think is really interesting from a measurement perspective is, especially with rotating signs, the way that those are sold or typically allocated are based on exposure within a stadium. But the way that value is achieved by brands is really the subset of that exposure that gets amplified on television or social media. And so you can end up in a world where the same asset, at a different point in the game will create a different level of exposure for a brand. And I think what increasingly, as you get to this world with effectively real-time measurement, is you can actually be more equitable in those placements. So it's not necessarily that 10 minutes of time in a stadium for one brand will create the same same amount of time of televised exposure for a different brand on that same asset. And so that ability to measure in real time could actually optimize the media value, which I think, frankly, makes both sides of the table happier.
Dan, are you saying location matters now? Are we at a point now where you are advising people where signage should take place and how often it should rotate?
Yeah, I think location has always mattered. I think, and Kyle can build on this, but the ability to measure location better and the differences in brand exposure between locations is creating more data-driven conversations. Of it's not just I want to be a part of the Commodores, but actually I want this asset in FedEx Field. And so I think for our perspective, the ability to measure with high granularity from a location perspective lets folks like Elevate have deeper conversations and ultimately lead to different actions with their clients. But Kyle, you might want to build on that.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, Dan. And when we expand on that a little bit, I'll give a really good example that happened relatively recently. We had a client that's very brand exposure focused. That's really the crux of how they make their decision-making process. And what we did was very counterintuitive. They had a sign in a Major League Baseball stadium that was on the first base side, almost equal with the first base line. And what we ended up recommending based on this data-driven source was how to push that sign further away from home plate when every instinct said to move it closer to home plate, it would get more exposure. By pushing it further away, we increased that exposure by nearly 75% per game. And, to Dan's point, it does make both sides happy because the property was able to get a renewal and the brand was happy to pay that renewal because they were able to justify it through that increased exposure.
Dan, I can't let it go. We're not the Commodores. We're not a band from Motown. We're the Commanders. But I do appreciate, There's a
little bit of pie on my face, Bram.
It's all right. We're not in Nashville. We're not the Vanderbilt Commodores, but I appreciate the shout out to us.
This is the learning curve of name change. I'm still getting used to Washington football team.
So am I. Trust me, I am too. All right, let's get back into some of the things you learned about it, which is uniform branding by teams. Dan, what did you learn about uniform brands these days?
Yeah, I think what's interesting with uniform brands is most of the assets, especially within March Madness, were very heavily curated. For the most part, if you look at the brands that received the lion's share of exposure, they were the Ncaa's official partners, and they were equipment providers, like Spalding or Wilson, which provided the ball. What's interesting with uniform sponsors is those are team level sponsorships, and so similar to what Kyle mentioned earlier of how folks were placing their bets on which teams will make the playoffs in baseball or basketball. That's very similar in uniform sponsorships at the college level, where we saw of the teams come in with a mix of Nike with the most sponsorships, followed by Adidas, Under Armour, and Air Jordan. But at each round, as those teams performed, you actually saw a different mix. And so there's actually a little bit of a game within a game from brands getting differential exposure as the teams that they supported advanced through the tournament.
Let's just talk about advertising in general in the modern era for a moment here, Kyle. We do a lot of discussions on this podcast about very different audiences, a younger generation that might consume content a lot differently than someone like myself who's middle-aged. And I'm watching the game traditionally, like the way that we're discussing here, and I'm seeing all these things happen. I would think a younger generation's kind of looking at this differently. As you kind of sift through all of this information that you have, when you go back to brands and talk about how it performed and how it could perform better down the road, what are you talking about? And are you talking about two different models for two different generations?
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right there. The way that you and I consume sports is very different than the way that the generation that's younger than us does. And there's no question about it. And what we're able to do is use this data to help us across a couple of different platforms, a couple of different ways. Still, the majority of value from a media valuation is driven by broadcast. In fact, what we see is in excess of 60 to 70% of the value is driven by broadcast today. I think we're starting to see the shift. And when we think about over-the-top networks, when we think about the variety of different ways that sports is going to be consumed, what excites me is that the opportunity to start to target audiences in a different way. The way that we're going to be, the Google AdWords is targeting people based on their behavior, I think we're going to get close to that in the very near future with sports. So when people consume sports on social media, can we deliver a different type of advertising using digital insertion, using technology to overlay advertising? When people are consuming over the top based on the market that they're in, can we deliver different advertising? And by the way, that exists today. If you're watching a Premier League game in a different market, you may see another advertiser than you do in the UK, as an example. So as we start to get more sophisticated, we're going to be able to deliver those targeted ads that are really going to change the paradigm for marketers. So not only is it going to be different advertisers, it could also be suggestions and different types of creative. If you're speaking to a different audience, the same brand might want to use different language depending on who they're reaching. So we're really excited about that. And it's critical that we have really strong data that explains exactly who's watching these different formats and how much of the time on screen those formats are delivering.
This is
I would add to that.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say, I would add to that where I think the other question that is starting to come up is beyond the foundational layer of how much exposure did I get and how much was that worth, is the question of what impact did that have for my business. So one of the, I think, really interesting points of data that we were able to put into the analysis that we published yesterday included some data from a company called EDO, which has the ability to connect Hive's data on in-content brand exposure or traditional commercials on television with online search activity for a brand or product in the minutes immediately following that exposure. And so what they found is that during the first and second round of the tournament, the men's tournament, the official Ncaa sponsors, so the brands that had both a higher ad load as well as placement within the games themselves, had a 43% higher search engagement rate than the average advertiser on primetime television. And as you moved to higher levels of sponsorship, so including the what was called the Ncaa's champions, which is AT&T, Capital One, and Coca-Cola, those brands actually saw a 69% higher search engagement rate. And so I think this starts to connect, not just that there's a valuable audience, but actually that audience is being moved to take an action and learn about a company from its exposure. And so I think that ability to connect occurrence to outcome is increasingly another area of interest for brands.
Kyle, I got to tell you too, it was reassuring for you to tell me that we're still going to be broadcasting sports as a sports broadcaster, because you'll hear people at a younger generation describe this dystopian world where sports is all TikTok highlights, and I don't think I'm ready for that yet.
Well, Graham, I'm somewhere with you there, and it concerns me from a sports media evaluation perspective for sure. But yeah, I think we are headed that direction where sports is consumed in these clips and these individual moments. And again, I go back to the technology allowing us to target different audiences and how important that will be to brands down the line.
All right, last thing, you guys both did a study on the Super Bowl as well. And I want to ask just general takeaways that you had from that as opposed to the NCAA tournament. And then secondarily, this took place in one of the most modern stadiums that we've had built here. There are other teams that are building as well. And I wonder, since we talked about location, modern amenities, and technology, how SoFi and maybe the things that it offered to broadcast partners and marketers might have been different than some of the traditional venues we've had, if there's been anything that was tangible that you saw there. If you want to start, Kyle.
Yeah, we spend a lot of time helping properties that are building new venues or that are renovating placement of signage in order to generate the most amount of exposure as possible. And I think what SoFi has done is exceptional in the way that they've designed the building with their video board but from a fan experience standpoint. But one of the challenges with that is that sometimes it can obstruct views for broadcast visibility, for sponsor exposure. What we found, in fact, is that by not having a center hung, you can actually deliver more value to your naming rights partner when you place them in optimal positions than you can in that center hung video. In some cases, it's not across the board, but in some cases that does matter. So when we talk about these modern improvements and integrations into SoFi Stadium, they certainly have an incredible fan experience, but how does it affect from a brand perspective and getting your message out as a brand? That's still the question that that some of the data revealed when we saw that some lower numbers for SoFi than maybe some naming rights partners have in previous Super Bowls.
Dan, what'd you learn from the Super Bowl?
Yeah, so I think the through line between both March Madness and the Super Bowl is obviously these are, among, if not the two most valuable tentpole events on television for sports. And the additional element of this that is important for the brands that are affiliated with that event, whether it's the stadium naming rights holders or other sponsors, is that exposure is more than just whistle-to-whistle value. So actually going back to SoFi and the Super Bowl, to Kyle's point, one of the things that was maybe a little bit surprising was during the game, SoFi got about 1 minute and 15 seconds of exposure during NBC's broadcast of the Super Bowl. But when you actually then step back and look at the week before and the week after, SoFi was exposed in almost 550 different programs on television. So there were commentators reporting from outside or inside of the stadium before the event, and after the event, there were days and days of highlights looking at the game. And so what that ultimately led to was for that 1 minute of in-game exposure for SoFi, they actually got 509 minutes of aggregate exposure, which led to essentially a quintupling of the number of impressions that they received from the TV viewing audience. And about 50% more media value in aggregate from looking at the totality of Super Bowl related exposure than just what they got within the game. And so I think, for these two events together, it really highlights the value of that comprehensive measurement. And a lot of what we're excited about to be able to bring to our clients and to partners like Elevate, where if you can actually look at data more holistically, you can make more informed decisions based on better data.
Dan Calpin is the president at Hive AI, and Kyle Folts is the vice president at Elevate Sports Ventures. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you, Bram.
Thanks for having us.
On the next Future Sport podcast, you are what you eat.
From there, a daily meal plan is developed and tells you what time you should be eating, but then also most importantly, what you specifically should be having based on where you are. So it's using a lot of geolocation technology too in that sense. If you're in the facility and if you're in the training facility, what's available there and how much of it should you specifically have for your pre-workout meal.
That's Kush Mahan, CEO and founder of ZoneIn, who devised a platform for dietitians to help athletes fuel their bodies on and off team property. That will do it for this episode. As always, the future is now. This is the Future Sport Podcast. I'm Bram Weinstein.